Councillors and Brian and Paul will make a start, sorry, so we can continue on. I'd like to welcome members back. We're back live streaming again and thank council members and council staff to this session. We've moved out of confidence, and this second workshop we've got Kate Hart, the Executive Director of Environment, Heritage and Sustainability, going to be talking to us about the Gorla River flood management mitigation, and we've got members of the public listening in, for this session, there's no set agenda, no minutes to be taken during this session. It's just an information session as per our normal workshop procedures. But yeah, welcome Kate, and I'll hand over to you for this session. Thank you.
Is that easier? That's yeah. Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor and Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you tonight. I've given this presentation now to all the councils, the landscape boards, the Indigenous Corporation and the Minister, and so it's really an update for the council in respect to the program that was established by the previous government to address some of the key issues in the Gorla River, and I'll just provide you with a little bit of update in terms of what will happen following the projects. So, as you'd fully be aware, the Gorla River catchment is a large catchment. It's quite complicated with the two river systems, but you'll see there that we've got the 6 council areas, 3 landscape boards, 3 Aboriginal nations, and we all know, I think we all appreciate that the Gorla River is a perch system. So once the water gets out, it doesn't get back in again, which is one of the more significant issues. And each of those 6 council areas have a slightly different approach to looking after the catchment. Clearly Adelaide Hills has got a very small portion of the catchment versus some of the other councils. In the previous term of government, there was a fair bit of lobbying that was undertaken in respect to trying to address flooding in the Gorla River and essentially to try and prevent the significant impact that flooding has on communities throughout. And some work had been undertaken in relation to modelling future floods based on the 2016 flood event that had significant impact both from a residential perspective and from a horticultural perspective. You'll well be aware of the flooding history of the Gorla River. It seems to flood nearly every decade, but Gorla is certainly in the centre of the flooding regime, and my project manager, who was unable to be here tonight, unfortunately, put together those photographs just to demonstrate that, in actual fact, since recording flooding, there hasn't been a significant success in terms of actually preventing flooding. The government of the day had a look at some of the issues associated with the Gorla River, and you'll see on the screen a range of projects or documents that actually have a relationship with water management, not least of which was the flood hazard plan. Due is the flood hazard leader for the state, and my flood team is critically involved in flood management, and you'll see there that there was an independent review undertaken of the 2016 event, which was presented to the government. The other works that have been undertaken in regard to looking at flooding as an issue relate, of course, to the Local Government Act, the Urban Water Direction Statement around stormwater management, the infrastructure strategy, stormwater management plans undertaken by various authorities, and the landscape plan. And we've got Green Adelaide landscape plan and the Northern and York Landscape Board, which both straddle Gorla. So who's involved in flood management? And Catherine has put this together to demonstrate that flood management is not an easy thing to address. And there's a wide range of authorities and businesses, individuals who are involved in flood management. And the 4 quadrants essentially relate to prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. Of course, local government has a significant role in all of those, but more particularly, I think the community feel that local government has a significant role in recovery. But in actual fact, prevention, as we know, is the best approach. And we're seeing the Australian government recognise that in their significant funding that's going to be coming through in terms of emergency management. A couple of years ago, the government of the day determined that in the budget there would be some money set aside to deal with some of the issues in the Gorla River. And in order to be able to facilitate best outcomes, a governance structure was established with the Department of Environment and Water managing a number of committees. So we have a management steering committee. Represented on that include Treasury, Emergency Services, Gorla River Flood Management Authority, and the chief executives of a number of councils, including your council, and Henry sits on that steering committee. A number of subcommittees report to that. The Project Delivery Working Group, they are specifically managing the 4 what we call critical short-term projects, which I'll give you an overview about in a minute. I chair the Business Case Working Group, which is the development of a longer-term approach to flood management in order to better position it for Commonwealth funding. There is a Stormwater Management Plan Governance Group established through the Gorla River Flood Management Authority, and they're looking after the Stormwater Management Plan that's being prepared for the lower reaches with funding from the Stormwater Management Authority. And we have been working with the Infrastructure SA group in terms of developing the business case, and I'll run you through what that business assurance framework looks like. So the 4 short-term projects that the government determined to fund are related to the Hillier Fireground rehabilitation works. Gorla Council has contributed to that project both financially and from a project management perspective. That was a result of the Samson Flat fires, where CFS responded to the fire emergency, but they do not go back and clean up. So whilst a lot of trees were felled to clear fire breaks, there was no work undertaken following the fire, putting the fire out. The Carmelo Road drain is a result of a stormwater management plan that the City of Playford undertook, and they are contributing a significant amount of money towards that particular project, and they're project managing that. That's underway. Improving flood forecasting and warning. We've identified that the flood gauges and warning system within the catchment is not comprehensive, and some of it is not integrated. So we've been working with the Bureau of Meteorology and the landscape boards in respect to looking at the overall management of flood warning and forecasting, and how we can improve a community who is prepared for flooding. We all know communities are generally prepared now for bushfire, and after many, many years, there's a huge focus on bushfire preparedness. We would like to see that level of preparedness for flood, so that the communities understand what is coming their way. And the last project that's just commenced is undertaking some survey work in the lower reaches of the river, looking at the levee banks and the vegetation management in those lower reaches. So I'm not quite sure if this information has been presented to you previously, but the project that you assisted in funding, the Hillier Fireground, has had a significant positive impact on that part of the river. And you'll see there the removal of the weeds, the removal of trees, the amount of timber that was actually removed from the river valley and then repurposed, some of which was repurposed. And we've now got some revegetation going in. And that's been a huge success for Hillier, and I think the community will certainly recognise the benefit of moving from quite a congested part of the river to a part of the river that will actually see the water be able to go through uncompromised. Improving flood forecasting and warning, as I said, we're looking at developing a optimal network in respect to that. We are working with the landscape boards and councils in terms of the ownership and management of the flood system, the gauges, and where some may be decommissioned or recommissioned or new commissioning. So that is currently underway. And then the last one, I'm sure there's like the lower reach one is in relation to the levies. Now, levies, particularly in the lower reaches, come in all shapes, sizes and quality. And Catherine has been going out and meeting with landholders, not only within Gorla, but the other councils listed there. It's surprising the attitude of landholders in respect to the levies. Some of them consider that they are critical, and so you've got very well managed levy system. Others just sort of dumped some soil there hoping that that's going to work. That leads to significant breakouts because they're not formed appropriately. And in talking to the community, she's also identified that a lot of community members who own properties adjacent to the Gorla River do not understand the impact of flooding. So notwithstanding the 2016 flood had over $70 million worth of damage to horticultural production, many of the property owners she's spoken to either didn't experience that or have very poor English and were unable to really understand the impact of flooding. So we've certainly got some work to do there. And we're very keen to work with the Indigenous representatives to look at cultural heritage within the river system, and they're very keen to participate in the project in terms of river survey work and then revegetation and all clearance where required. So I'll just check that there were the 4 projects. I think I'm not sure if I've missed one. The Camelo Road Drain project, I didn't have a slide on that, principally because it's a engineering project within the City of Playford that they're managing as a result of their stormwater management plan for Smith Creek. So moving on now in terms of the longer term issue. So it's all very well to have some short-term projects. That's not going to resolve the issue of longer term flooding. So whilst we might be able to clear some of the river system for water flow, it doesn't actually address the issue of how do we manage high volume water within intense events. The Gorla River Steering Committee determined to engage Infrastructure SA in a methodology around looking at a longer term business case. Infrastructure SA is an independent body. They provide advice in regard to positioning significant projects at a state level and at a Commonwealth level. And in actual fact, for us to seek funding at a Commonwealth level, we actually need Infrastructure SA to acknowledge the project and endorse it from a state government perspective. So we've been working with them in terms of some of the approaches that we could take, everything from establishing a new piece of infrastructure within the river system to alterations to the existing infrastructure, including the Bruce Eastick Dam, through to levy management, planning policy, community engagement. And we've gone through a whole range of assessments, not only with residential community, the horticultural community, but also with councils and the landscape boards in order to be able to generate really some opportunity to say to the Commonwealth, this will give a much better integrated approach to flood management. I'll just skip over that one for the minute. So the assurance framework creates a process that reviews, evaluates, and then identifies preferred projects. And there are various levels of assessment that are undertaken for each one of those projects. And in order, I guess, to develop up the best case scenario to deal with intervention. The review is undertaken by independent experts, and there are various what we call gateways in respect to that. We've just provided a overview of the options analysis, which are the options I've just identified, in order to be able to get an opinion as to whether, one, we're on the right track, and two, is it one or more of those options that we need to be pursuing in terms of a longer term solution. The panel determined that we are approaching the project or the business case in the correct way, and had identified the preferred, not the preferred outcome yet, but all of the options in terms of dealing with floodwaters, and have determined that in actual fact, because we've identified all of those options and we have some foundational positions, that it is feasible for us to proceed to now developing up a full business case. So they look at the preliminary information. Yes, we think you've got a business case here. Now we want you to proceed to developing up what would be an agreed position to put to the Commonwealth. So we're working on that now. And we believe that what will happen is there won't be one solution, there'll be a combination of solutions. Now each of those will be prioritised, so whether it's raising the Bruce Eastick Dam, putting in a new flood mitigation structure, putting in what has previously been identified as the Northern Floodway, which is redirecting floodwaters, we will actually prioritise all of those in the full business case development. That will take some time for us to do, and we are working closely with the Gorla River Flood Management Authority to ensure that the stormwater management plan that they are undertaking is actually fully integrated with all the information, so that we're actually on the right track. So we know there are significant challenges in the Gorla River. We know that high rainfall intense events cause problems. We know that there's fragmentation in relation to management. We know that no one group or no one authority is going to take control of the Gorla River. The majority of it is privately owned, so that in itself is a significant issue. But we know that there are benefits. As I said, the 2016 flood event, we have figures that there are about $70 million of horticultural damage. That doesn't account for the residential damage, the damage to council infrastructure, the inconvenience to residents, damage to their properties. So we are working on trying to develop up exactly what the quantum of that damage is, and we're working through the local government finance authority and directly with councils to get that information so that we can build a financial business case in terms of what those damage costs are. We know if the floodwaters are managed, whether it provides a water source or whether it's just managed, there's better economic outcomes for the community, particularly in the on the Gorla floodplain around Virginia and Anglevale, but also because there's no interruption to business even further north, there's better economic opportunities. And we know that if the community is fully engaged, they will be prepared for flood management and actually be able to assist in a better way. So there are significant benefits for us to continue working on a longer term investment. But a longer term investment is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be one solution, and it's not, as I said, going to be delivered by one authority. We are in a partnership here, and I think the state is very committed to a partnership, but it will require funding from both local government and the Commonwealth government if we're going to succeed in delivering longer term solutions. And I know there's been some work going on between the councils in terms of different potential funding solutions that could be put on the table. I know that's not completed yet. The state doesn't have a position in terms of how much it would seek to contribute. We need to get the business case done so we actually know what the quantum is. But we're probably looking at around $60 to $80 million worth of work that will need to be done in the future. And as I said, we know that that's not going to come from one source. And it does need a long-term commitment to the project rather than a short-term commitment. So that's really wraps up where we're at. And I'm happy to take any questions. But it was really just a short update for you and for me to just be able to come and meet with you and let you know that, you know, we're committed to trying to find a longer term solution, but it is probably going to take us still a number of years to get to a point where we can sign something off if we can.
Thanks very much, Kate. I think Di's got a question.
Thank you for coming along. I've got 3 questions. Our stormwater, does that go into the river system or not? From the roofs?
Yes, it does, but yeah.
It does?
It does,
Okay.
yeah.
So with the development of Springwood and Concordia in the future, it's just going to increase, because if the water can't go, if it's going on roofs, it's not going into the ground, becomes stormwater, so therefore it makes the flood worse. Second question is with funding, you're saying you get federal funding. I'm not saying you shouldn't put in for it, but how much do you think you're going to get, considering the floods they've had in the eastern states? How are they going to distribute that, or are they going to get all the funding? That's another thing. And then when I first came on council this term, you took us on a bus trip, which took us from the Bruce Eastick Dam down through the plains. And I found that to be very, very interesting, and to understand how the water flows. And I mean, you can look on a map, but when you actually see it, I really enjoyed that. And I was just wondering whether you could plan something like that for the new council that comes up, because there will be, and it wasn't just Gorla, it was all the councils that could come on the bus. So, and thank you again.
Thanks, Di. Yeah, the bus trip was really beneficial.
Yes, certainly we can look at providing that sort of interaction again, because, you know, as I'm aware, of course, local government does change, so we need to bring new members on if there are new members at the council. In terms of the Commonwealth funding or the federal funding, the federal government has just announced $200 million worth of funding for risk management. And so there is a sizable amount of funds sitting there. They haven't yet determined how to distribute that, but no doubt we'll be seeking to make application for funding in relation to the next step in terms of developing up the business case. It's difficult to actually indicate now what the quantum is going to be. The funding for the Northern Floodway, we've estimated it at around $60-odd million in today's figures. So that's just one element. If we go for a combination, then clearly we're looking at significant money. I don't think we would see a solution for under that sort of funding today, particularly given the increased costs associated with anything to do with construction. And really it's about building a strong business case and developing up the partnership that ensures the Commonwealth says, yes, we've got everybody on board with the project, this is worthwhile funding. There has been funding coming into South Australia for flood management. So Adelaide Plains Council received funding for their levee bank work around 2 wells. They received that last year. I think it was about $10 million worth. So South Australia does receive funding for this sort of work. It's a matter of ensuring the business case is as comprehensive as possible and as compelling as possible in order to be able to deliver it. But my team work closely with the Commonwealth staff in terms of emergency response and risk management. We've got very close relationships with the Commonwealth Government, and we will continue to maintain those and try and position any future work accordingly. And in terms of site visit, we can certainly organise something in the new year for councillors, and we can have a look at how we manage that.
Paul, you've got a question?
I'm just thinking about the funding. Is the state looking at something like the Landscape Board levy and maybe a stormwater management levy across the state or not?
We haven't yet determined a preferred method of funding works. It's unlikely that the government would want to put in a levy to fund works in the Gorla River.
I think broadly though, for all stormwater management.
Well, there is work that is undertaken in terms of water levy management, and there's work going on at the moment in terms of the Northern Adelaide Plains. I can provide you with some further advice. It's not in my area, but in terms of how that's being managed. The Landscape Board itself, of course, looks at water levies, and so that sits outside of the Department of Environment and Water. And we're currently just looking at the levy equalisation system that was put in place with the new Act. So we're looking at levies at a high level, but potentially not at that day-to-day level.
Any other questions, councillors? No. Brian, question?
Hi, Kate. Yeah, the one thing that's always bothered me with Gorla here, and it was interesting what Diane said about you know, the water off of Springwood and all the development that's happening around here. But I've raised the matter so many times, but back in 2010, when I was mayor, there was an old gentleman that used to work for the ENWS, and Eric Worrell, he's now died, but he was very, very concerned, and he had all facts and figures and everything. And he was going to give me those figures about the fact of the three major creeks that come down from the side of our hill, Potts, Alexander and Kentish Creeks. And they all run down to one section where just recently there's a house block for sale at the end of those three creeks. And I'm not sure if you know where I'm talking about, the one that runs up past Potts Road, Alexander Road and Kentish Roads. They all come down, and if we had a flood, anything like those in Queensland, Grantham and places like that, and they're no different because I've actually been to Grantham and seen where the floods came from. But we've just been very lucky in South Australia. We haven't had that happen. You know, are those creeks taken into assessments when you look at the planning for our town? Because the whole of the area of Gorla Green and all those areas would be totally underwater if we got a Grantham flood. I was just wondering if that's ever been looked at, because I would have loved to have had the maps and all that he had, but I don't know where they are. And so forth. The only other thing, it was to do with Buckland Park. You know, everybody's saying, you know, is this ridiculous or what? And it's all happening. And I remember back, as I say, 10 years ago, where there was, you had a map up there. It was probably better to bring it up if you, and I'll just point, yeah, back that one. No, sorry, just go where the two creeks come in. No, go back to the other one, a bit further down. That one. Yeah. See where the legend is at the bottom on the right-hand side there, the map. There's a creek, which is the main Gorla River coming down, and there's a green area. And at the particular time, Colin Pittman was well involved with the Gorla River floodplain management, and there were suggestions very strongly about making a channel that went on the high side of that little round green ring that's there, which would take the water down to desolate land, which is down there, Port Gorla, St Kilda, down through there, to totally not allow it to run in there. But nothing was ever done. I mean, at the time, I think we probably had about 20 meetings about it, and it all sounded like a good idea. Was that ever considered, in your view, about making a channel which diverted the water away from places like what's going now? They don't call it Buckland Park because it's got too much of a good name, you know. So I just wondered whether it was, yeah.
So in terms of your two questions, the first one in terms of planning or zoning land, taking into account water courses, it's really an issue for the council to consider its zoning policy. The stormwater management plan will take into account water flows, and there's the stormwater management plan for the lower reaches, quite a complicated project with a lot of variables that are essentially inputted into a flood model, and then the model is undertaken to identify what the extent of flooding is, and that model will account for all water going into the catchment. So I can confirm or otherwise whether those creeks are part of that, but essentially the flood model will identify the different variables, the amount of water going into the catchment, and then the flood mapping that can occur based on current levels of development. In terms of Riverlea Estate, which is at Buckland Park, they have been working with my flood team to develop up a system of waterways around the town, around the residential area, to try and prevent flooding of the homes. And they are developing up a waterway system which will accommodate floodwaters. Part of that water system will actually be quite unique because they want to use a saltwater-based system, so there's always water in the channels, but essentially the channels will have enough capacity to be able to take floodwaters based on current data. Now, the issue we have, of course, is more intense development within the catchment may then increase that volume, hence the desire to look at some intervention as well within the system. And we've already spoken to the Walker Corporation in terms of seeking their partnership in regard to what a future solution might look like adjacent to their development and whether they're prepared to contribute to something. But it's a complicated matter to get the funding model right, so that, and the location of the intervention in the right spot. There's no doubt that there is increasing water going into the catchment. The Barossa Council has got some significant residential development happening in the Barossa Council. They're trying to deal with that within the Barossa Council. So they're investing in a fair bit of stormwater management planning and stormwater management infrastructure to respond to that. And no doubt other councils, like regional, will have to deal with that as well in terms of their residential development. But it does put more pressure in the system if that stormwater is going into the catchment. We can plan for what we know today. We can run some models in terms of increased water and what that means in terms of flooding. What we can't potentially do is run the model on all of the levees where it's going to break out, because the levees are in such varying quality and quantity that it could break out anywhere. And that's what happened in the 2016. It broke out in a spot that wasn't expected to break out. Once it's broken, the levee bank is broken, you've lost control. Of course, we all know that. And so that's one of the issues associated with the fourth project, trying to get a survey undertaken so we know the veracity of those levees, to try and start predicting if there is going to be a breakout, but that's always going to be a challenge.
Paul, you've got a question too.
How far do you go back, like you were talking about working out floods and stuff? What I'm getting back, I was brought up in Two Wells a long time ago, and I can remember floods at the Buckland Park and Two Wells area back in the 50s. I was then a copper there in the 80s, and we had floods again. So now, but now we've got more people building in the catchment areas, so we're going to have more water down there. So it must be mind-boggling to work out. So some of those levees, which were changed after the 92 flood, alleviated a lot of the problem. But then what happened in 2016, and that's before we got all these new buildings at Springwood and everything else. So being a 70-something-year-old bloke who's seen floods since 1952 when I was brought up in Two Wells to when I was back there as a copper in 83, to me there hasn't been any changes. So I don't know.
Yeah, look, I can certainly concur with some of that sentiment. I think the scenario is that we probably won't ever prevent all flooding. So even though we might put an intervention, further intervention in, there is a likelihood that we can't prevent all flooding. What we're trying to do is manage the floodwaters in such a way that the impact of that flood is less than what it has been in the past. But it's a difficult scenario, trying to balance expectations, development, water flow, vegetation management. Some people think that if we just clear out the river valley, that the water will go through and it won't flood. We know that's not actually the scenario. And we don't want to actually have a concrete lined drain that'll actually just pour out at the bottom end of Buckland Park. That's not going to resolve it either. So it is a combination approach, and trying to work with the planning system. So the Planning and Land Use Services is currently doing a flood overlay plan for the planning code to try and then provide the information around flood management. That's really based on today's information versus, you know, development that's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years. So we can't, I don't think we can set up an expectation of managing floods to the point where it just won't flood. It's actually how do we minimise the impact? And that's where I think the Northern Floodway proposal came about, which was trying to minimise the impact, which was directing water to the northern side of the river. That may not be the solution though. So it's certainly a complicated project to work on.
Yeah, there's also the early warnings work that, you know, if you get the warnings out 24 hours, 48 hours before, people prepare, and there's 80% or more or less damage straight away because people lift things out of the flood zone if they can. Another question, Paul?
My main reason for picking up, like you're talking about a plan, so if there's so many councils involved and there's going to be flooding, my concern is that they say, right, this council's, because of their developments, contributing X amount of volumes of water, so they'll get hit with a levy more than another council that does something that we have no control over. That was my guess, that where we allow development along the river, if we as a council do the right thing, say Gorla does the right thing, but a council above us doesn't, then we are set then to fix that. But if we bring in a government where the government says X amount of dollars, and every council, as long as they take good practice, shouldn't be hit with a levy. You see where I'm coming from? That was my main concern.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. And we haven't yet determined what a preferred funding model is. We do have a model which is quite successful, which is the Brown Hill Creek, Keswick Creek Authority, where they've been very successful in gaining Commonwealth funding to deal with flooding throughout the eastern suburbs. And they've put in those big wetlands in Victoria Park. They're going to extend those all the way down through to Anzac Highway and beyond. And that is quite a successful partnership. It took a lot of time and consultation and effort to pull that together. But those councils are now working collectively to deal with stormwater management and flood management. And I think that's the sort of approach that we're looking at with the Gorla River. You've had the Gorla River Flood Management Authority in place for a long time. In actual fact, I was at the City of Playford when that was orchestrated, so participated in pulling that together. It potentially needs to evolve in terms of what its function is and how it's managing flood management. But that's an issue that that authority needs to consider, and what its involvement is in relation to the overall, not only funding model, but management model for the Gorla River catchment. At this point in time, we haven't got a funding model, and I wouldn't ever suggest that the government would introduce a levy, because this current government has a position of not introducing new levies as a political position when they went to the election. So I haven't got a position to put to you in terms of the funding, other than to suggest that if we can work in partnership and identify preferred solutions, which are valued, which we put a value on, then what is the contribution? And then I'd be in a position to be able to go to the state government and say, state government, you need to contribute this amount of money based on that and the contribution from local government. Then we go to the Commonwealth government and say, we've got a funding model here. We need you to significantly contribute to that. And that is a pretty traditional approach, but I think for this, it will probably work, versus trying to introduce some sort of user pay levy system that's really probably not going to actually sit comfortably with anybody.
Yeah, thanks. Brian, you've got another question? Yep.
Thanks, David. And Kate, as you know, we all finish up in November. and hopefully come back next year. But Diane and David and Paul, with their comments, they said about the fact of understanding, you know, like for the new council to come in and for people. I mean, you know, like you go for a drive all the way to Truro and you cross the creek there and it says, this is the North Para River. And, you know, you're talking of 120 kilometres of catchment area. Now, we've been very lucky that we haven't seen the Queensland and New South Wales floods and everything. But I also agree with both what David and Diane said. The bus trip to the people that you want to support projects in the future, the one we did down the Gorla River there to see, you know, some of the obstacles that have been put in place and some of the banks that weren't done properly and all those sort of things. I think it's very important if you need to convince the new elected members and anybody in particular that bus trip around the area, first of all, go and say, well, this is where it starts from. Anybody can say, you're kidding me, you know, but, you know, for any of you that don't know where I'm talking about, go for a ride up to Truro and see how deep and big the river is. And we're out at Shadow Yaldara the other day and just have a look how high the banks are there, because that's all been under water. Thankfully, we're not going to get that sort of rain. Well, we may, and that's where you say, who knows? But it certainly helped. The bus trip, I think, was excellent.
Yeah, it was very good. Is there any further questions? I'd like to thank Kate very much for coming along tonight and going through this quite complex and quite a huge issue. And yeah, it is a very important issue for Gorla as well, because we do have a lot of areas that are under threat when it does rain quite heavily, and we do have floods in the area. So no, it's very good. I'll close our workshop as well. So thanks members, thanks council staff and people watching it on the feed. Thank you.